welcome back to my channel. I'm Charlotte. Today we have such an exciting video. I am going to be doing my top 10 books / series of 2024, which is one of my favorite things because I really get to reflect on what I enjoyed reading that year, and I put effort into like ranking it. And yeah, I'm so excited. At the moment, I've read 143 books, so picking a top 10 is really hard. Just know, like, these are like top tier. I think about these regularly. They're the best. I also wanted to do a quick sort of like honorable mentions that didn't make the top 10, but I loved them so much that I gave them 5 stars. So for romance, we have Out on a Limb by Hannah Bonham Young, which I read really recently, and it's the sweetest romance. It's accidental pregnancy, and that put me off, but then I heard so many good reviews that I read it anyway, and everybody was right. It's amazing. Then we have Just One Taste by Lizzie Dent, which is such a cute romance that takes place in Italy, where she's basically traveling around Italy with her sort of nemesis. They have to write this cookbook together, and they're like just eating Italian food, having great banter. There's also a lot of depth with it and like dealing with family tragedy and grief, and it was just so good. And then the last romance mention is Life's Too Short by Abby Jimenez. I loved this so much, and it also made me cry. There was a lot of talk about like chronic illnesses. Basically, it's about these 2 neighbors, and one of them suddenly is fostering a baby, and the guy basically comes over and is like, your baby is like being so loud, and she's like, yeah, what do you want me to do about it? And then he like helps her, and then they basically just like keep helping each other out and become like really good friends, and it's just so cute. It made me sad as well. But it was really good. And then for fantasy, I have The Crimson Moth, which is an amazing romantasy, witch versus witch hunter, great enemies to lovers. It's set in like a Regency era, so it kind of gives like Bridgerton vibes with fantasy. It was incredible. Next we have A Fragile Enchantment, which also happens to have like those Regency Bridgerton vibes. I fall for it every single time. I think it's so good. And this one is sort of like more of a slower pace, like very magical, whimsical fantasy about this tailor who is like designing clothes for the royal family, and the prince and her like don't get along at first. Then we have Emily Wilde, the second one in the series, which I think is Map of the Other Lands. I read Emily Wilde book 1 last year and I liked it, but I wasn't obsessed. And then I read this book and I was like, oh, I'm obsessed. I love these characters. I love this world. I love everything about it. So, and then What the River Knows, which is a fantasy set in Egypt. It's got lots of mythology happening in it. It was so interesting. There was a good romance. I was just intrigued the entire time. Those are my 7 sneaky, throwing them in there, honorable mentions. Now into the official top 10 books / series for the year. Making this list was actually so hard because I think I came up with my top 10 pretty easily, but then ranking them amongst each other was very tricky. So I'm hoping my mind doesn't change too much, but who knows. Coming in at number 10, we have The Shepherd King duology by Rachel Gillig. So this is One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns. These books were so good. They're like a gothic fantasy. They're set in such an interesting world with a very intriguing magic system that basically depends on these cards to do magic. They're sort of going on a quest to be able to find these specific ones to complete a set. The romance was so good. It was like morally grey main guy, and then the girl sort of like had this sort of like inner demon almost. You'll understand once you read it that like she sort of was figuring out about herself and this like darkness within her, and it was just so good. And I will say the pacing of it was really good because the second book brought in like a new point of view, and so it kept it very like fresh and interesting, which I loved, and it introduced another romance, which was so good. Coming in at number 9, we have Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. I love Abby Jimenez so much. I've loved all of her releases. I've finally finished all her backlist, and I've given Part of Your World, yours truly, and this one all 5 stars. I absolutely loved this. We're following our main character, Emma, who sort of randomly meets this guy through a Reddit thread that they like are commenting on. Like they're both kind of saying like, oh, every time I date someone, they end up breaking up with me and finding like their perfect person afterwards. So like I'm cursed. And then they end up making a plan to sort of like date so that they can break the curse, because then if they each date each other, then they'll have to find their perfect person afterwards. Like, it's a kind of ridiculous concept. It's a stupid idea. And would I go meet a stranger that I met on Reddit? Probably not. But it was cute. But as with all Abby Jimenez books, they start out cute and fun, and you're laughing and you're giggling, and by the end, you're probably sobbing. They're so good, and she really writes stuff so realistically that you manage to feel for the characters so much every time you read one of her books. Like, even if you haven't experienced the thing that they're going through, you just like feel so strongly what they're feeling, and you just want everything to be okay for them. So that is my number 9, and I would definitely recommend reading Part of Your World, then Yours Truly, then this one, because you don't need to, but there are connections in it that sort of altered my life when I read them, because I had the knowledge of the previous books. In number 8, we have The X-Files by Jessica Joyce. I'd heard good things about this, but I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, and I absolutely adored it. Like, from the prologue, I was highlighting, I think I read it on my Kobo, so it's all on there. I haven't tabbed the book yet, but I was highlighting like everything. Like, I feel like I highlighted like literally half the book. The first thing, the way she writes was just like beautiful, and I just like fell in love with that. So the premise of this one is we have these two main characters who used to date. They sort of grew up together, they were best friends, then they dated, they broke up. They don't really talk anymore, but they have this third friend that they grew up with who is getting married, and they are sort of like the best man and woman for him. And so they are helping out with the wedding and organizing sort of a lot of stuff for him, because everything sort of keeps going wrong with the wedding. And so they are sort of having to put their differences aside to help mutual best friend out. So it's kind of like, it's a second chance, it's a forced proximity. A lot of the time with second chance, I'm like, why did you break up? Or I'm like, okay, you broke up and you probably should stay broken up. But this one, it was like, I could understand why they broke up. Like, they were sort of moving in two different directions, but the way that they had changed since then sort of made sense for them to come back together. You could just feel so much tension from the page. Like, you could feel their whole history in the way that they would talk about each other. And then the personal journeys that each of the characters were going on as well really like added to the story and made me feel so much. The main girl was like very fearful of like losing her friends and sort of everyone moving on without her, which I think is such like a human experience and written in such a beautiful way, and I absolutely adored it. Now, my number 7 book for the year is The Dagger and the Flame by Catherine Doyle. This was another one that was like quite unexpected. I requested the ARC on NetGalley because it was going to be a fairy loot hit, and so I was like trying to be good and suss out if I would actually like the book before getting the special edition, and I ended up completely and utterly obsessed. This is a fantasy book set in City of Phantom, and you're basically following two characters from sort of very rival, not gangs, but like groups. So they call it two enemy guilds. So the thieves and the assassins, and they sort of like don't like each other. And basically for a lot of the book, the main guy is trying to assassinate the main girl. If you are looking for enemies to lovers, read this, because they're enemies. They are literally trying to kill each other constantly. You also have our main girl sort of doing like training to become a thief. It was just so good. It was one of the best enemies to lovers I have ever read in my life. I love enemies to lovers. It's my favorite trope ever. The world was just really well done, and I really am so excited to read the rest of the series. I think it's going to be like a bigger series. The way that it ended, I'm very keen to see what happens next. The next one is a whole series, and that is the Windy City series. So we have Mile High, The Right Move, Caught Up, and Play Along. Ratings for these are 4 stars, 4.5, 5, I'm obsessed with this book, and I think 4.25 I gave this one. This is a interconnected standalones romance series. So each book follows a different couple, and they're all sports romances. And there's a couple different sports romances included in them. I just love this series so much. The found family is done so well. It sort of builds up slowly throughout the series, and by the last book I'm just like, oh my god, I love all these characters so much. And they're always just like so well written, where the romance is built up so well. The men are always so sweet that you fall in love with them, and like their acts of kindness for the girl. Oh, and they're always also like really funny. I find myself laughing a lot with these, and in particular Caught Up was my absolute favorite. This one is a single dad slash nanny trope, which like I don't look out for or anything, but it was so sweet. Like, it was so sweet. I think I just really related to Miller in this book, who is the main girl. Like, I actually cried at the end of this, and I was like, how am I crying at like a sports romance book? And I will say, first book is unnecessarily long. Like, it doesn't need to be this long, and some people really don't like it. Read the first one, you're like, that wasn't that good. I would encourage you to keep going. I think the fan favorite is The Right Move. Okay, we have made it to the top 5. My number 5 is Saving and Redeeming 6 by Chloe Walsh. So these are connected, part of the Boys of Tommen series. The first 2 books are Binding 13 and Keeping 13, and they follow Johnny and Shannon. And this follows Joey and Aoife. This was so good, and I still get emotional thinking about it. If you haven't heard of this series, it's like high school, late high school romance. Basically is following like this group of friends in high school. It has amazing found family, but there is a lot of trauma that basically everybody has gone through. These books are not lighthearted at all. There are funny moments, but majority of the time you just like feel sad. You feel like worried for these kids. You feel so sad about the circumstances that they're in. So please go in knowing what to expect, I guess, and check the trigger warnings. If you are interested, they're so good. They are thick, but I couldn't get enough. I listened to the audiobook for these ones, and I'm so glad I did, because they had Irish accents, and I could like hear afterwards like the characters' voices in my head so clearly. Like, I felt like I knew them. I won't say too much about these 2 in particular without spoiling other books, but they were just so good, and they broke my heart. And I love Joey and Aoife. I think they're so funny together, and they go through so much together. And yes, I'm excited to read Taming 7 next. And now my number 4 is the Infernal Devices series by Cassandra Clare. Yes, I know I am so late to these. I never read them when I was in high school. I was in my dystopian era rather than my fantasy era. I really wanted to read all the Cassandra Clare books, just catch up and see what I was missing out on. So I wanted to read all like 15, but I only ended up reading 6. So I read the first 3 books in the Mortal Instruments series, and then I read these ones. And the Mortal Instruments, I found like, it's okay, but these characters are pretty annoying, and there is that like absolutely insane plotline with the romance. If you know, you know. But this was so good, and I actually could not stop thinking about it for like weeks afterwards, the way that it ended. So we are following Tessa. It's set in, I think it's like late 1800s. She arrives in London to stay with like her family, I think, and she ends up getting like wrapped up in the Shadowhunter world, which, if you're curious what that is, it's basically like our world, but then there are these Shadowhunters who can sort of, they basically like fight demons. And this world sort of has like a bit of everything. It's got werewolves, it's got vampires, it's got witches. Okay, so I'm re-recording the last like 4 because my mic switched up and I didn't realize, so that is unfortunate. I don't remember exactly where I was up to, but I think I was talking about Clockwork Angel and the Infernal Devices series. This series, the plot was so interesting to me straight away. Found family in this book was amazing. I literally cared about every single character, which I feel like doesn't usually happen, especially compared to the Mortal Instruments, where I truly despised like every single character in that book. The romance, so there is a love triangle in this book, which I don't normally like, but this is genuinely the best love triangle I have ever read about, ever. And the way that it ended, like, I will think about it forever. I truly will. And I don't want to say too much to give spoilers, but wow. I loved this series. I would highly, highly recommend. Even if you are like me and you're very late to the game, I would definitely recommend giving it a go. Now for number 3, and that is Immortal Dark by Tigges Germa. This book was so good. So I was very kindly sent the arc of this book from Hachette before it came out, and so I sort of picked it up. I was like, this sounds good. It's got vampires. It's like set in an academy, university type setting. Like, it'll be fun. And then I read it and I was like, oh no, like I'm obsessed and this is my whole new personality. And then I didn't shut up about it for like months afterwards. So in this book, we are following our main character who is looking for her sister, who she believes has been taken by vampires. Basically, in order to look for her sister, she goes to study at this university where you've got like humans and vampires together. She's a human. And to go there, she has to live in this house with this vampire that she despises. Can you guess where the romance is going? The whole university setting was so interesting. The sort of like vampire lore that you learn about throughout this book is very, very, very interesting and like quite different to a lot of other vampire books or like movies that I've seen, which I think like made it feel sort of like unique and like its own story while still having that sort of like vampire feeling to the book. The plot was really interesting. The characters were all so morally grey. Like you kind of were like, I hate you, but I also, for some reason, I'm still rooting for you. The romance itself was truly like top tier, one of the best romances I've read. It was enemies to lovers, and it was enemies to lovers. Like they hated each other, and they hated each other for like continuously throughout the book. The feelings that I got from like these two main characters like reminded me of like the feeling I would get when I was watching Vampire Diaries when I was a teenager, and I would see like Damon and Elena. Like that is the sort of like feeling that I had when reading this. It was just so good. And the author is actually Australian, and so she did like a book tour around here, and so I got to meet her and get my book signed and hear about her like talk about how she created the book, and I just absolutely, I loved hearing that, and she was so sweet. This is YA, like you'll find it in the YA section, but it's actually quite dark, like it's sort of bordering YA and adult, so just be aware of that. I guess it did feel like quite dark, especially for YA. But yeah, I love this one so much. Okay, now my number 2 book for 2024 was Daydream by Hannah Grace. This is the 3rd book in the Maple Hill series. The first 2 books are Icebreaker and Wildfire, and I adore those books as well. This beautiful copy, one of my friends went to an event with the publishers and she very kindly got me a copy of the ARC, and so I got to read it early, and I was so grateful because this was one of my most anticipated reads for the year, and I ended up literally obsessed with it. If you haven't read the series or you haven't heard of it, it's set at a university. You're following like a group of friends. The boys all play hockey together and some of them like live together. It's a very good like found family. Like you really care about all the characters and their sort of friendship group. It's very sweet in that sense. I love a found family. I would also say for all the books in this series, the plot is not heavy. Like the plot is there, but it's not super strong. It's very character driven. So also be aware of that if you want to pick it up. But I loved it because I love the characters so much. In this book we have Henry, who is like a fan fave character from the previous books. He's sort of like the sort of like joke star. He's also like very sweet, and you know there's like more going on to him, and so I think this like was done really well to like dive into what's going on in his head. And then we are following Hal, who is sort of like a bit shy. She's a bookworm, which we love. She likes baking. she sort of keeps to herself a little bit, and then she ends up meeting Henry, and he sort of like introduces her to all their friends. Her journey is sort of like figuring out her place in the world and like at the uni, and like figuring out where she fits in, because she's always sort of felt like a bit like an outsider. Yeah, their journey was so cute. They sort of meet, they become friends first, and they become friends for like a pretty significant portion of the book. Romance doesn't sort of get acted on until later in the book, in my opinion. I really like, because they had so much of an emotional connection built up. Yeah, it was a really sweet romance, and the characters I just felt like I related to so much that is why I like tabbed this book to death, because I was just like, everything they could say, I'd be like, oh my god, that's me. Now for my number one book of 2024. If you know me, you probably know what it is, and that is Funny Story by Emily Henry. Emily Henry never misses for me. I love her books so much. They get me every single time. I just adore her writing. In this book, the premise is actually so like interesting. We're following two main characters, which is Daphne and Miles, and both have their own partners at the start of the book, and their partners were childhood best friends. And so Daphne is actually about to get married to her partner, and he comes home and he's like, no, I'm actually in love with my childhood best friend, and we're gonna go run off together and we're gonna get married. And she's like, what? And so basically her and Miles are left behind while their exes sort of run off together. And she's like, okay, well, where am I gonna live? Like, I was living in your house. And so she ends up moving in with Miles. And so first of all, that premise is so fun, because it's like a spin on sort of the classic romance trope of like these childhood best friends like falling in love all these years later, but like now we're seeing how the partners of those characters feel. They become roommates, and they're sort of dealing with, you know, getting dumped and moving on with their lives, and like Daphne's trying to figure out like how she fits into this town since she moved there for her partner. You just sort of see them slowly become like friends. Like at first she's just like, oh, we're probably not going to talk that much, we'll just be roommates, like we don't have that much in common. And then they slowly like realize that they get along really well, they find each other really easy to talk to, and you just watch like a really good friendship form between them, which then turns like romantic, obviously. And one thing with Emily Henry is she knows how to like pace a romance so well for what I personally love. Like she does a great job of sort of like having moments that like build a lot of tension in sort of small ways, and then it sort of like breaks and you're like, oh, I wanted them to get together, and then you build it again, but it means that like they don't like sort of rush into getting together. You get like a really good burn throughout the book. And the other part I loved was the relatableness. Daphne was actually quite similar to Hal in Daydream. She's a book lover, and her sort of thing throughout the book was trying to figure out like how she fits into the town that she's in, like how she fits into the world basically, and like finding her own friends, because everything has always been like her exes. There was just so many quotes throughout this book that I just was obsessed with. As always with Emily Henry, the banter was immaculate, genuinely making me laugh out loud. I will sometimes just go through the quotes and be like, oh, that's a good one. That is my top 10 books for the year. Here is my top 5. I really hope that you enjoyed watching this video. Let me know if you have any top books in common with me, or what your top books are for the year. I would love to know. I love hearing about what everyone read this year and hearing them talk about books that they love. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for watching. I'm looking for a